I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. It has been a bumpy ride for me the past few weeks. I had a family member that was sick, and then I got sick afterwards, so I haven't been updating nearly as much in the opening week of this month, but I'm back in the saddle now, and I want to remind you that I am currently without an advertiser, so I need your support at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that out of the way, that plug, let's get right to it. On this edition of the show, we'll be hearing from returning guest, sociologist Robert E. Bartholomew, who has been tirelessly attacking the story of Havana Syndrome from a skeptical point of view. He does not believe in the conspiracy theories about sonic weapons or radio wave weaponry and whatnot. He's the co-author with Robert Ballow of Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the real story behind the embassy mystery and hysteria. And most recently, he wrote in the Skeptical Inquirer about the problems with 60 Minutes coverage of Havana Syndrome in a piece entitled Smoke and Mirrors, the 60 Minutes breakthrough on Havana Syndrome Exposed. I think we got a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty of the problems with sensationalistic narratives about Havana Syndrome in this interview. The last one, we only had 30 minutes, I believe, give or take. In this conversation, we had about 40 or so minutes. I think we dug a little bit deeper, and I think you'll find the conversation rather interesting. And it's not an attack on people who believe they suffer from Havana Syndrome, because they are experiencing something. We'll talk more about that in the conversation to follow, though. So, with that being said, let's get right to it with Robert E. Bartholomew. Welcome back to Parallax Views. American medical sociologist, journalist, and New Zealand-based author, Professor Robert E. Bartholomew. He is the author of the book, Havana Syndrome, Mass Psychogenic Illness, and the real story behind the embassy mystery and hysteria, with Robert Ballow. And he's also the author of a recent piece that caught my eye in the Skeptical Inquirer entitled Smoke and Mirrors, the 60 Minutes breakthrough, in quotes, on Havana Syndrome Exposed. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
So I think, Robert, my listeners have a good idea of what Havana Syndrome is, but in case they don't, maybe you can give a rundown, because I've heard everything from, it's microwave attacks to, allegations of sonic attacks, and it's very strange.
Yeah, when you say a lot of the listeners may know something about Havana Syndrome, the problem is people don't know the full story and they just get a little bit of the story. So back in late 2016, some people in Havana started hearing strange sounds and feeling unwell. It spread to the Canadian embassy after the American embassy, then it spread around the world. And that became known as Havana Syndrome because it started in Havana. And the initial folk theory was it was a sonic weapon using sound. And more recently, people have claimed microwave weapons and energy weapons and stuff like that. And there's just so much misinformation out there. And I think when people know the full story, initially they think, oh, mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria, it's ridiculous. It doesn't cause brain damage. It doesn't cause hearing loss, doesn't cause white matter tract changes. But those never happened. And people don't understand the facts behind what really happened. And that's what we have done, Professor Barlow and myself.
So maybe you could talk a little bit about this 60 Minutes special from CBS News on Havana Syndrome. They've done multiple episodes on Havana Syndrome. What do you think the most egregious errors were?
Well, the whole thing. Look, I started out as a journalist. I worked at a CNN radio affiliate in Albany, New York in the 1980s. And there's nothing wrong with a journalism outfit presenting information and speculating, which is what they did in all three of the episodes. Now, Scott Paley said there were four. I'm not aware of that. Maybe I think it's the behind the scenes episode that they did counted as the fourth. But so if they want to do that, fine. But you should give the other side, because without giving the other side, it's just propaganda. It's all trying to get clicks and views, and it's deception by omission. To say that 60 Minutes engaged in deception, 60 Minutes America engaged in deception is absolutely accurate. They are deceptive. It's sneaky. It's unbecoming of a professional journalism outfit. And I'm not happy about it.
When you're explaining mass psychogenic illness to someone, what's the best lay definition of it? How do you explain it to a lay audience?
Well, think of mass psychogenic illness. It's a form of functional neurological disorder. Think of yourself as a pilot in an airplane. And all of a sudden, there's a button flashing that says your right engine is on fire. And you can feel the heat and you can see it. But your right engine isn't on fire. And there's nothing wrong. It's not a physical ailment. It's a software problem. And think of it that way. The nerves and neurons that send messages to the brain become disrupted. And so that is mass psychogenic illness in a nutshell. Yeah, and people don't understand. We're not calling, if somebody has a functional neurological disorder, mass psychogenic illness, we're not saying they're crazy. We're not saying they have a mental disorder. It's a collective stress response when it happens collectively like it did in Havana. And why do we suspect that there? Because one of the Journal of the American Medical Association studies found mild brain anomalies in the Cuban cohort, which is not unusual to find mild brain anomalies like that. And that got reported in the media as brain damage, which it was not. And even in the study, they said the anomalies were not so significant. They couldn't have been caused by individual variation, which means it's not very significant. And so why would they have minor brain anomalies? Because when they went to Cuba, which is a foreign adversary, and they're living there, they were told that you will be surveilled 24/7, even as you sleep in your house. And then after they got there, they were told, oh, we think that you might be the target of a sonic weapon. Don't stand or sleep near windows. And that went on for months, and that's what triggered the stress that those people were under.
Throughout the article, you talk a little bit about vestibular conditions. Can you speak to how that ties into all of this?
Well, yeah. So if I can just point out, I'll just give you one example of how they were deceptive in the segment, the most recent 60-minute segment, and the earlier one as well. Well, in the when the 2022-23 one, they talked about this guy who had been in China with his family, and they were attacked over there several times, and then they came back to the U.S., and they were being looked at by some people at the University of Pennsylvania, and they were staying at a hotel in Philadelphia. And in the middle of the night, the guy looks at one of his two children in bed. They're thrashing around a little bit, and he bends down to pick them up. And just as he does, he hears this whooshing sound like water running. The implication in the program was that that's some kind of microwave or sonic weapon. They don't give an alternative explanation. Any neurologist would know that someone hearing a sound like water running, that's tinnitus. And in fact, it's common for people to get up in the night and to go to their water faucet to turn it off because they think it's on. They never gave that alternative explanation. And there are many things like that 60 Minutes did that are downright deceptive. And it's just really not becoming of a professional news outlet to give one side like that. It's kind of like a Bigfoot documentary, right? You can just load it up to make it look like Bigfoot's there, and you don't give any of the other side. So look, the vestibular system deals with the inner ear, balance, spatial awareness, our sense of gravity. And so when this first happened, people are reporting symptoms to do with the vestibular system. And so when the Journal of the American Medical Association got the first study, the first JAMA study, and a lot of people don't know this, they went to the world's leading authority on the vestibular system. His name is Robert Ballo at the UCLA Medical Center, who is the head of the Neurotology Center dealing with the spatial awareness, inner ear, vestibular issues since 1974 up until recently. He has written the standard textbook in the field. And so they went to Bob Ballo, and Bob Ballo looked at the article and he rejected it. And they published it anyway. And then later he contacted me and he said, let's write a book about this. I can't believe that this is happening. Now, some of the tests that were done with the JAMA studies and with the Michael Hoffer study that dealt with supposedly vestibular damage, Bob created those tests. So I think Bob knows what's going on there. And he just rejected it, that they have not demonstrated vestibular damage or brain damage, which has been claimed. And so he is somebody who is a leading authority in this area, and he's adamant that they never demonstrated brain or vestibular damage, but it got reported in the media as such, and it got reported that there was hearing loss, which was not true. Before one of the JAMA studies, before the Hoffer study was published in December of 2018, information was leaked to the press that about a third of the patients had hearing loss. But when the actual study came out, they found only 2 patients had hearing loss, both of whom had pre-existing hearing loss, before they had gone to Cuba. So they had told the researchers they thought they had hearing loss, and that got leaked and reported to the press. But when they actually gave them the standard hearing test, they didn't have hearing loss. So that's another myth that's out there. And the white matter track changes, that was leaked to the press. And when the actual study came out, it was no greater than normal, 2 mild, 1 moderate. It's just normal distribution. So that just all these things about brain damage, white matter track changes, hearing loss, not true, never happened.
With regards to the 60 Minutes, the latest special on this, they talked a lot about having a smoking gun, and then it became, you have to look at means, motive, and opportunity. And they focused in, I guess, on a Russian military unit known as 29155. And they really focused in on a Russian journalist who found a document where one of the unit's officers had paid for work on non-lethal acoustic weapons. And you take issue with the way that's been framed. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It's ridiculous. Okay, so they show this document in Russian, and it mentions the guy worked for a non-lethal acoustical weapon. Okay, fine. Non-lethal acoustical weapon, and by the way, that's the only part that's in English. They don't translate the rest of it. Non-lethal acoustical weapons, that's our LRAD, LRADs, long-range acoustical device. It's a sound cannon. And nothing unusual there. There's a number of governments around the world that use sound cannons to break up demonstrations. It's basically loud sound. But they use the word sonic in there, and it sounds like some secret weapon or something like that. No. And how much did he get? He got $1,700 for his troubles. And they also mention the group that did that, Der Spiegel and 60 Minutes, and there's another group there. They mention that they started that study around 2012 because studies like that, because Putin said they were way behind with what the American research was. Okay, fine. So you're telling me that over the course of 4 years, they suddenly caught up and they've got some kind of sonic weapon developed? And it just doesn't make any sense. And then there's this crack unit that goes around the world, right? And this woman, who's the wife of a Justice Department official who's visiting Tbilisi, she was supposedly attacked in her laundry, right? And she hears this high-pitched sound, and she feels unwell. And so she looks outside, and she sees a truck parked directly in front of her fence. And there's a guy standing out there. And there's a video camera taping it all. So that's the crack Russian unit who's just attacked somebody. You're telling me they just attacked somebody with some kind of weapon, microwave weapon or sonic weapon, in her laundry. I'm not sure why they would do that. And they parked their vehicle right in front of her gate, and the guy's just standing out there right in front of a video camera. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense at all. I have no doubt that somebody from the unit might have been in Tbilisi at the time, which is next to Russia, and they would have people around in different areas. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Why would you disable this woman who's the wife of the... And then look, at the NATO summit, they said somebody in the American contingent at the NATO summit, the most recent one, was struck. They give no symptoms. They don't say who it was. It's all very vague. Why would you strike them? Vladimir Zelensky was at the summit. Why wouldn't you attack him if you got the technology? It just doesn't make any sense.
Can you speak a little bit to the issue of what I've noticed is when talking about Havana Syndrome, people go from talking about sonic weapons to microwave weapons. And I feel like, that there's a little bit of goalpost moving when they do that, because those are two different things. Can you speak to that?
Well, here's the thing. Why do even people think of that? And you go back to patient zero, right? Patient zero was in Havana, Cuba in late 2016. He worked for the CIA undercover. He was the first one to report symptoms. He heard this beam of sound outside his home at night, speculated about it with other officers, and then in late December of 2016, he went to the embassy, and he had headache, slight hearing loss, and he had ear pain. And he suggested to the doctor there that he may have been attacked. But why would you think that? Because those are common symptoms you'd have in any GP office around the world in any day or week. Very common symptoms. Then he went around actively trying to get other CIA officers and then embassy staff to report any symptoms they had had over the past few months that he thinks may have been linked to that sound. And so he was actively lobbying other people. Then around the new year, 2016, he went to a New Year's party, and he had the sound that he had recorded from the attack, and he was playing it for other people and getting them all whipped up and to report that they had symptoms as well, and they may have been attacked. Then the embassy thought that maybe there was some type of attack. That recording was later analyzed by top scientists who deal with sound. And they concluded it was the mating call of the Indian short-tailed cricket. So why are we even talking about sonic weapons and microwave weapons? Because there was no evidence in the first place. By the way, governments have done research on sonic and microwave weapons. American government, Russian government, Chinese government. There's a problem. It doesn't work very well because of something called the laws of physics. And governments have worked on a lot of different things. They worked on the Men Who Stare at Goats movie, right? They worked on this belief that you could do remote viewing because they heard the Russians were doing it. So for about 20 years, from the late 70s to the early 90s, we invested millions of dollars in trying to see if soldiers could psychically tell what was going on through remote viewing in Russia. And after 20 years, it was evaluated and they dumped the project because they said there was no evidence it worked. Give them credit, they tried it, but it didn't work. But you can say, oh, we've researched this, we looked into it for 20 years. Yeah, but it didn't work. And with the laws of physics, a weapon using sound is going to dissipate. And 99% of the sound waves are going to bounce off the outer wall. And it would be like standing at one end of a football pitch with a squirt gun and trying to hit a target at the other end, 100 meters away with a squirt gun. With the laws of physics, it's not going to work very well. And the same with microwave weapons. There's all sorts of things that should happen if you're firing a microwave weapon at somebody, assuming it could work, okay? Number one, you're going to feel very hot, of which I'm not aware of people reporting that, because it's going to heat your cells. Number two, other things are going to happen, like a screen door, a screen. The metal is going to heat up. Your computer is likely going to shut down, electronic equipment and stuff like that. None of that was reported. And now after we've said that, people can allegedly claim that that happened later, but I'm aware of nobody even claiming that even after the fact. There's just no evidence. There's no evidence. There's no intelligence intercepts. And this is being kept on life support by people like David Relman, who's a good microbiologist, but he got hoodwinked into claiming that, oh, there was brain damage and there was vestibular damage. There's no such thing. And he keeps saying that there was. And his panels, the only two panels that suggested pulse microwave radiation were the ones that he headed. And David Relman's panels have all kinds of problems with them. For example, they said it couldn't be mass psychogenic illness. Well, they botched the criteria for mass psychogenic illness. They gave the wrong criteria. They used the short-term anxiety one, and they should have used the long-term neurological one. I mean, there's no question about that. That's not my opinion. It's 100% fact that they botched the criteria. And I know the criteria very well. I've written 5 articles in science journals with a man who created the criteria, who, by the way, was on the National Academy of Sciences panel to begin with. And then they kicked him off because he suggested mass psychogenic illness as a possible cause. So what you're seeing is politics, and it's mixing with science here. And David Relman's panels were all loaded with believers and rogue scientists.
I know that you actually have, I think you've spoken to one of the people involved in those panels, Dr. Beatrice Kalam. Okay, can you speak about your interaction with her?
They're using her stuff, which is not mainstream science about microwaves and stuff like that. But then I asked her at a conference, so what do you think of mass psychogenic illness? And she said, well, it can't be mass psychogenic illness because there's no evidence that the patients were colluding together to feign their symptoms. Well, she doesn't know anything about mass psychogenic illness because that's not mass psychogenic illness. Collusion is not involved. Feigning symptoms is not involved. And then I said, what do you think of mass psychogenic illness? She says, well, I don't think it exists. Okay. Next question. I mean, she is not a mainstream scientist, to be kind to her. She is not a mainstream scientist. So why are they interviewing her on the panel and not interviewing myself, Bob Ballo, Sergio Della Sella at the University of Edinburgh, mainstream skeptics of Havana Syndrome? None of us were interviewed. They loaded up the panel. And then, if I could just interject, the CIA, the FBI have now concluded what we concluded in our book in 2020, which is there's no evidence, credible evidence, that there was an attack. And if you listen to what they're saying, you know, they're very careful not to say negative things about the patients. The symptoms are real. That doesn't mean they were attacked, because functional neurological disorders can give you the same effect. And that's what's going on here. You know, as I said, now 60 Minutes Australia has just done an episode on Havana Syndrome. They use some of the material from the American 60 Minutes, but 60 Minutes Australia is a better news organization because they gave the other side. They interviewed myself and they gave the other side. Maybe not as much as the microwave people, but they gave about 5 minutes to the possibility of mass psychogenic illness and functional neurological disorder. By the way, I have people say, they criticize me, they love to criticize me, and they say, okay, well, how do you explain the brain damage, the white matter tract changes, the hearing loss? Now, I've already discussed that. It's not true. It never happened. Then the other one is, oh, mass psychogenic illness. That's ridiculous. How can you say it's all mass psychogenic? I have never said it's all mass psychogenic illness. What I've said is probably outside of Cuba, the vast majority of people reporting symptoms, 1,500, probably has nothing to do with mass psychogenic illness. It's just people waking up in the morning and feeling unwell, but they've been told by the State Department and the Department of Defense, who put all 3 million personnel around the world on alert in the military and the State Department, diplomats, and people who work for the intelligence agencies on alert to be on the lookout for strange sounds and feeling unwell. So now people are on the lookout for strange sounds and feeling unwell, and people feel unwell every day. And people hear strange sounds every day. And the next thing you know, you got 1,500 cases people are reporting and thinking back over the last several years. And people have been feeling unwell. I mean, the problem is with Havana Syndrome, the symptoms. I have a list of the symptoms here. Headache, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, disorientation, forgetfulness, confusion, tinnitus, insomnia, balance problems, head pressure, difficulty seeing, ear pain, depression, nosebleeds. I mean, it goes on and on. And these are symptoms that have been experienced by just about every human being who's ever lived in any given week or day of their lives, right? Ever since we've lived in caves. So that's the problem with Havana Syndrome. And then people like David Relman, they say, well, Relman's a smart person. Yeah, he's a smart person, but he's a human being. And he's out of his field of specialty and depth. And, you know, people have a tendency, genetically, we're pre-programmed to connect dots where there are no dots. And they start seeing patterns where there are no patterns. That's why David Relman's small panels, 2 of them, both concluded that pulse microwave radiation was most likely explanation. But the FBI had access to much more stuff than he saw. And they didn't conclude that. The CIA, the same. Center for Disease Control, National Institute of Health Studies. None of them concluded what the David Relman panels concluded, which were all loaded with believers and no skeptics.
I wanted to ask you about the National Institutes of Health Studies that happened, because you've cited the intelligence community, reports. Can you talk about the National Institutes of Health Studies?
Well, look, in a nutshell, let me do it this way. Yeah, the 2 JAMA studies from 2018 and 2019, and then you had the 2018 Michael Hoffer University of Miami study. These were bad studies. The real mystery of these studies is how they ever got published in the first place. As Sergio Della Sella at the University of Edinburgh has pointed out. I mean, there should never have been studied. They're really bad studies. Like, just when we go through that in our book. We always said if you do a really good study with really good controls, you won't find anything. And guess what? They did a really good study. No study's perfect, but the two National Institute of Health studies are far superior to the earlier JAMA studies and the Hoffer study, and they found nothing. They found no brain damage. They found no vestibular damage. And so, I mean, some of the controls they used were people at the embassy at the time. I mean, just far superior studies.
If you have a few more minutes, I just wanted to wrap up on this point. I was recently arguing with someone about Havana syndrome because I'm of your position. I think this is mass psychogenic illness at the root of it. And they said to me, oh, well, you don't think the Russians could do something? They're not dastardly enough. I mean, it's essentially what they were saying to me. And I'm like, it has nothing to do with what I think Russia is willing to do.
What you've got here is two moral panics. One is a moral panic over the fear of new technology, fear of mobile phones, fear of 5G, fear of Wi-Fi. This has been going on for a couple of centuries now, ever since they developed the telephone. Right? There was a fear of ice cubes when refrigerators first came out because it was created artificially, right? And people are claiming to get sick from it. Now, so you got a moral panic going on over the fear of new technology. This is some new technology that's been developed, right? And then there's a moral panic over the Russians and the fear of all things Russian. And it's a longstanding moral panic over fear of foreigners, right? It just happens to be this is the Russians. Before it was the Russians, it was Muslims, right? Before then it was communists and homosexuals, and it goes on. And then it was the Russians again, right? Turn of the century. So, and it was the Germans at the turn of the century as well. So you got these two moral panics going on at the same time. And they have combined quite nicely with what's happened in Cuba. Now, ask your question again.
What I was going to say, this is the question I was going to get at, is this person is yelling at me saying, well, you don't understand, the Russians are capable. And all I said was, if we take this Havana syndrome stuff at face value and say that, oh, it's all microwave and sonic weapons, then that leads us to we could end up believing in a lot of crazy nonsense.
That's right.
You know, there's people that claim to be electronically harassed, that claim to be targeted individuals. Are we supposed to just believe their claims rather than looking at more rational alternatives? And I think this opens up a door to believing in a lot of bunkum. And I wanted you to be able to comment on the dangers of that.
Yeah. So look, there was a long history in America, certainly over the last 100 years, of giving the Russians in the former Soviet Union a lot more credit than they deserve for developing all kinds of weapons and being able to do all kinds of things and having infiltrated the government in the 1940s and 50s, and they're in every community. So this is nothing new. Just the form is new. And the more you look at this, the more you know about it, the more skeptical people should become. 8 out of the first 21 victims in Cuba recorded their attacks. They asked them to record them. They did. 8 of the first 21 victims. And in the Jason report, the secret classified report with top scientists analyzing these sounds, concluded that they were the mating call of the Indies' short-tailed cricket. You can't make this stuff up. There's just no evidence that it's a sonic or microwave weapon. And you've got journalists like Adam Intos, formerly with the New York Times, Washington Post, New Yorker. I think he's embarrassed for getting the story wrong. And now there's a desperate attempt to try to keep the story going and muddy the waters a bit. And I love to be interviewed by Adam Intos because there's a lot of questions I love to ask him that he'll have a hard time asking. I think
any question in particular?
Well, he got sucked into this, and then he's been reporting on one side of the story all along. He's given very little time to skeptics like Bob Ballo and myself. And he's just loaded up on one side of the story. And it is not becoming of a respected investigative journalist. Well, how come you didn't interview us? We were right in the thick of things. Bob Ballo was the first person that was involved in evaluating the JAMA studies. He created some of the tests they were using. How come you never interviewed Bob or myself? I went to Cuba. I've talked to the Cubans. There are a lot of questions I'd like to ask Adam Mentos. Yeah, I was on a podcast where they interviewed him and then they interviewed me. They asked him the same questions, but our paths never crossed. But I suspect there's a lot of ego in there as well, because he did get the story wrong. He got the story wrong for years and just reported on one side of the story. And that's not good journalism.
I guess in closing, what I really want to ask is, do you think there's a danger to the public and to the institution of journalism when this story is being pushed and no skeptical views are being offered on Havana Syndrome? What do you think the threat is? How does this affect us, the public, and also the institution of journalism?
It's really sad. I began my career as a journalist. It is a sad state of affairs. And it's a sad state of affairs when you have a respected news outlet like 60 Minutes America do such trash, sensational, tabloid television. I'd love to go one-on-one with Scott Pelley, because I'd pick him apart for what he did with his one-sided programs and deliberate deception by omission, leaving out key information. Like that woman who was supposedly attacked in the White House grounds. Classic vestibular issues. 35% of people over the age of 40 will have a vestibular issue dealing with the inner ear, balance, spatial awareness, gravity, sense of gravity in their lifetime. They left all that out. They never gave any alternative diagnoses and suggested it was some kind of microwave or sonic attack. Shame on Scott Pelley. That's just trash journalism, and it's disturbing. And I would love to go one-on-one with Scott Pelley.
With regards to the public, do you think the way they're being misinformed on this issue is also just, I think it's going to affect the public at large. And I think we've seen the ways in which moral panics can lead to very bad outcomes for innocent people, even in the US. I mean, I don't know what this could mean for, Russian immigrants in the US, but I could see bad things happening out of moral panics. Can you comment on that? And then we'll close.
Well, I get a lot of bad emails, people threatening emails, and people saying I'm an evil person because, you got the TI community, and that's really interesting. The target individual community who for decades have claimed that they're being cyberstalked and things like this, right? Targeted with these weapons. It's curious how the people involved with Havana Syndrome steer clear of these people like the plague. They don't
I've
want
noticed that as well.
They don't want anything to do with them because they don't want to be brought into the claims surrounding them, because I think a number of these people have mental illnesses and they need to take medication. Not all, some of them might have some kind of condition that we don't fully understand yet. But the bottom line is they're not being cyberstalked and stuff like this, but they think they are. And so soon after this stuff all came out in August of 2017, the Associated Press ran a story in which they had received and interviewed people, about 36 people who had visited Cuba over the last few years, and claimed that they had been at the same hotels, those two major hotels where most of the attacks had claimed to have taken place, and that they had had similar symptoms. How come nobody ever followed up on them? They're not in the government, but that kind of fell through the cracks, right? They were there. How come nobody in the government, if they think this is real, ever investigated this? The bottom line is now the CIA and the FBI and the intelligence community has concluded, as we concluded back in 2020, in 2019, and in 2018, that it's not an attack. I was the first person to publish an article in a medical journal in December of 2017, 4 months after this was first announced. And my conclusion, it was not there. It was psychological. And that article has aged well in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine.
So, I'm not trying to keep you overly long.
Yep, it's fine.
But since
It's
you
fine.
mentioned
Yep.
the targeted individual thing, do you think this is feeding into? I mean, I don't want to attack people that are having issues in their own mind, but I feel like this does feed into delusions that some people have, including people that consider themselves targeted individuals. Do you think that? Mhm.
I mean, the people I've met are really nice people. There's a guy, Len Burr, who's a former physician. Very nice individual. Couldn't ask for a nicer person, and very well spoken. And I believe he claims to be a targeted individual. And he's kind of a spokesperson for that group. But I'd like to see some outfit, maybe the NIH, do a study of them. Get a group of targeted individuals together and do a study of them and the symptoms they're reporting so people have a better understanding of what's going on. I mean, there may be, maybe they're not all mentally disturbed. There may be some condition we don't fully understand that's not caused by some sonic or microwave weapon, because I don't believe it for a minute. But these people are honest, sincere people, people like Len Burr. He's an honest, sincere person, a very nice person. And I would love to see a study of him and other people and see what they find out. I don't think you're going to find out that they're targeted. I think you're going to find out there's some kind of conditions. There'd be a composite of different conditions going on. And unfortunately on Twitter, on X, there's a lot of nasty stuff that goes on. People get very emotional and stuff, but yeah, it's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in, a very partisan world. I hope to testify before Congress, I hope later this year, on this issue, because to go before a hearing, congressional hearing, you really need to, I've been on the case from the beginning, and they can throw all kinds of questions out there. And I'm very familiar with all the points at this point. So I think I can handle myself. But you don't want somebody who's just come into this and is just recently familiar with this, because there's so many twists and turns here that you need to be familiar with it from the start.
I want to thank you again, especially for drawing that parallel between Havana Syndrome and claims of targeted individuals, because I do think Havana Syndrome is a variant on that, even though people are trying to ignore the fact that it's a variant of those, I would call them delusions. Thank you for that.
Sure. And I'm not saying, and I've never said that all the cases are mass psychogenic illness. I've never said that the people who have these symptoms are crazy or have a mental disturbance or anything like that. It is a collective stress response, mass psychogenic illness, that can happen to anybody. It happens to groups under prolonged stress, the type that happened in Cuba. And by the way, I'd love to debate David Roman sometime. There's a lot of questions I could ask him. And yeah, for starters, how come he didn't read our book, which was out for more than half a year before his panel conclusions came out, and they just ignored those? How come they kicked Simon Wesley, who was the expert on mass psychogenic illness, off his panel? How come you loaded up your panel with believers and not the prominent skeptics? No prominent skeptics whatsoever. I'd love to debate David Roman. I'd love to debate Scott Pelley. I'd love to challenge these people. And I don't think they would fare very well. I don't. That's an open challenge.
Well, I hope someone takes up that challenge. I think that needs to happen. I want to thank you again, Robert Bartholomew, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work, and what do you hope they get out of this conversation?
Well, there's more than just sound bites and what the media is reporting. There's a lot of behind the scenes stuff that people don't know. They don't know that Bob Ballo, most people don't know that Bob Ballo, the guy I co-wrote the book with, who's the world authority on vestibular damage, was the first person the JAMA editors went to, and he rejected their study. That Simon Wesley, who's the expert on mass psychogenic illness, got kicked off the National Academy of Sciences panel for suggesting that mass psychogenic illness was involved. There's a lot of stuff behind the scenes people just don't know, and the more you know, the better we look. And look, the government, the American government, could have saved millions of dollars if they read our book and reach the conclusions that we had reached earlier. But what the CIA has concluded, the FBI has concluded right now is there is no Havana Syndrome, the National Institute of Health study. And that's what we concluded years ago. And it's the same conclusion that we reached. So yeah, I'm on Amazon, and I have a website, Bartholomew.com. And I am a down the line mainstream scientist. I don't believe in Bigfoot. I don't believe that global warming is a hoax. I believe the Holocaust happened, and I'm a mainstream scientist. And just because there's scientists out there that the media goes to over and over and over again, just a few of them, doesn't mean it's real. And I can go out and find somebody with a PhD right now who believes in Bigfoot, who believes in people are being abducted by space aliens, which is different than people think that there may be intelligent life in the universe. That's a whole different question than people are being abducted by space aliens. And I can find those, and I can do some documentary, and people can think it's real, but that doesn't make it real. There is no tooth fairy, and there is no Havana Syndrome.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Robert E. Bartholomew. Let me know what you thought about it on Twitter or the Parallax Views Facebook page. If you enjoyed the episode, spread the word about it, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.